Liberia, 1990. A nation fractured by tribalism, soaked in betrayal, and dragged into one of the most brutal civil wars of the 20th century. At the heart of it stood a man, equal parts revolutionary and tyrant, Charles MacArthur Taylor. To some, he was the man who toppled a dictator. To others, a warlord who made monsters of boys, mined diamonds with human bones, and auctioned a nation's soul to the highest bidder. But how did an American-educated accountant become one of Africa's most feared war criminals? This is not just the story of Charles Taylor. This is the anatomy of a power-hungry mind, a disintegrating state, and the descent into darkness that follow. Massachusetts, 1985. A county jail door creaks open. 4 years later, a country burns. How does a Boston-educated accountant become the mastermind of a civil war? This isn't a work of fiction. On an autumn day in 1985, Charles Gankay Taylor quietly disappeared from a jail in Plymouth County, Massachusetts. By Christmas Eve, 1989, he was leading an armed rebellion across Liberia's eastern border. Yet to grasp how a scholarship student turned fugitive turned warlord, you need to understand the fault lines etched into Liberia long before he was born. Liberia's story doesn't begin with colonial conquest. It begins with an experiment. In 1816, a group of white politicians and planters in the United States formed the American Colonization Society, ACS, to relocate free black Americans to West Africa. By the 1820s, they started sending settlers, and in 1847, those settlers declared the independent Republic of Liberia. They built a nation in their own image, complete with a flag, a constitution, and a capital named Monrovia. But they also imported America's racial hierarchy. The Americo-Liberians, descendants of those settlers, kept themselves apart from the indigenous tribes, holding all political and economic power. They were never more than 5% of the population, yet for more than a century they ruled. Indigenous Liberians were legally considered subjects, not citizens, and were shut out of government and business until 1904. It was a slow-burning injustice that never exploded until 1979. That April, President William Tolbert's government proposed a modest increase in the price of imported rice. In any other country, it might have been a minor policy debate. In Liberia, where rice was both staple and symbol, it became the spark. Thousands marched in Monrovia's streets. Soldiers fired into crowds and beat protesters with rifle butts. The uprising left hundreds dead or wounded. The rice riots shattered the myth of Americo-Liberian benevolence and exposed deep resentment. A year later, Sergeant Samuel Doe seized power in a bloody pre-dawn coup. Doe, from the Kron ethnic group, promised to empower native Liberians. Instead, he centralized authority, favored his own ethnic group, and relied on repression to maintain control. Liberia became a pressure cooker. All it lacked was someone to direct the steam. Enter Charles Taylor. Born in 1948 to a Gola mother and Americo-Liberian father, he grew up in the quiet town of Arthington. Those who knew him remembered a stubborn, headstrong boy. His mother once said he was different from other children, willful, defiant. That stubborn streak matured into ambition and charm. Taylor wore tailored suits, loved to dance and stage public spectacles, and possessed an uncanny ability to captivate audiences. His charisma opened doors, but it was paired with an almost performative zeal for power. In the early 1970s, Taylor won a scholarship to Bentley College near Boston, where he studied economics. His time in the U.S. was formative. He joined the Union of Liberian Associations in the Americas and criticized the Tolbert government from afar. He saw firsthand how America's bureaucracies worked, and he learned the language of business, logistics, and political organizing. He washed dishes to pay rent and earned his degree with grit. Friends recall a man who could pivot between textbook finance and heated debate about African liberation. He loved attention and had a knack for rallying people to his cause. When Sergeant Doe toppled the old order in 1980, Taylor returned home. Doe appointed him head of the General Services Agency, an innocuous title that belied its importance. The agency managed the procurement of vehicles, supplies, and property for the government. It was the hub through which contracts and money flowed. Taylor quickly built networks of suppliers and contractors, but within 3 years, Doe accused him of embezzling nearly $1 million from state coffers. Taylor denied the charge, insisting he was targeted because he was a threat. Whether he stole or was scapegoated, the accusation sent him back to the United States in a hurry. There, Taylor's story took a cinematic turn. On arrival, U.S. Marshals arrested him at JFK Airport. He was detained in Plymouth County Correctional Facility while awaiting extradition to Liberia. During his detention, he wrote letters to lawyers and appealed to former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark for assistance. He told anyone who would listen that he feared being murdered if he returned to Doe's Liberia. And then, in September 1985, he simply vanished. The escape remains shrouded in mystery. Some claim he sawed through a thin metal window bar and climbed out. Others suspect help from sympathetic prison staff or covert U.S. agencies. Taylor later hinted that American authorities had a hand in it, but there's no concrete evidence. What's indisputable is that by the time Doe's government sent an extradition team, Taylor was gone. Taylor's disappearance wasn't an end. It was a beginning. He resurfaced in Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi had established guerrilla training camps for rebel movements across Africa. Taylor learned to wage unconventional war, built ties with fighters from Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, and forged alliances with leaders like Thomas Sankara. In Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire, he recruited young Liberians, many barely teenagers, promising them a new dawn. They trained with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades, their loyalties tied not to ideology, but to Taylor's magnetism and promises of revenge. By 1989, he had formed the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL. On December 24th that year, while most Liberians prepared for Christmas, Taylor and around 100 fighters crossed the border from Côte d'Ivoire into Nimba County. They took the town of Butuo and proclaimed themselves liberators. Taylor called himself Tatai, meaning father, and presented the rebellion as a crusade to unseat Doe and end Americo-Liberian hegemony. He would later say it was a war for democracy and justice. But even then, rumors spread that his recruits included child soldiers, and that he was less interested in democracy than in seizing power for himself. So who was Charles Taylor at this moment? A charismatic populist? A man scarred by his own exclusion who sought to tear down the elite? Or a self-styled liberator who would later become as ruthless as the men he toppled? His stubbornness, ambition, and charm were forged in Liberia's inequality and honed by American education and international intrigue. He saw opportunity in chaos and had the audacity to believe he could reshape his country. Whether he intended to free Liberia or simply rule it, he was about to set the nation alight. Christmas, 1989. Taylor's rebels cross into Nimba. Within months, he controls most of Liberia, and children call him Popeye. How does a charismatic accountant become a leader feared by millions? When we left Charles Taylor at the end of Chapter 1, He had just crossed Liberia's eastern border with a handful of fighters. By mid-1990, he was the most powerful warlord in the country. How did he grow so fast? Partly through force, partly through performance. Taylor understood optics. In the rebel camps, he wore fatigues cut to fit like tailored suits. He broadcast messages promising justice for indigenous Liberians, but he also demanded absolute obedience. Fighters called him Papai, meaning father. He dubbed himself Tatai, a play on Tata, father in some local languages. His charisma, honed at Bentley College and in Boston's African diaspora circles, made young fighters feel they belonged to a cause. But behind the charismatic speeches was a man who would use any tool, fear, drugs, diamonds, to win. Taylor's National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, grew rapidly after the 1989 invasion. Villagers fed the fighters out of fear or loyalty. Men joined to avenge slain family members. But soon, the NPFL's tactics shifted from liberation to domination. Both Taylor's rebels and rival factions preyed on civilians. Between 1989 and 2003, Liberia's civil wars killed an estimated 150,000 to 250,000 people and displaced more than half of the population. All sides committed torture, rape, sexual slavery, summary executions, and forced conscription of children. When Taylor's attack began, tens of thousands fled, and thousands were raped, tortured, or killed. Taylor's forces were notorious for their small boys unit. These child soldiers, some as young as 9, earned Taylor's trust because they were malleable. A relief web analysis drawing on Human Rights Watch's Easy Prey noted that the NPFL and other Liberian factions used thousands of child soldiers. Many were not abducted but joined voluntarily after their families were murdered or to escape starvation. Once recruited, commanders coerced them into horrific rites of passage. Children were forced to kill or rape someone, or throw a person into a well to prove loyalty. Those who hesitated were told they'd be shot. Taylor's charisma played a part here. He convinced boys that brutality was courage. To dull their fear and control them, commanders plied them with alcohol, marijuana, amphetamines, and a mix of cane juice and gunpowder. A child care worker later told Human Rights Watch that lots of children are used at checkpoints. Kids get promoted for committing an atrocity. They can cut off someone's head without thinking. In 1990, as rebel factions battled in Monrovia and President Samuel Doe was captured and killed by a rival, Taylor's NPFL controlled most of Liberia outside the capital. International mediators brokered fragile ceasefires. Taylor sent delegations in designer suits to peace talks, while his fighters committed massacres on the ground. In 1997, after years of bloodshed, a war-weary population elected Taylor president. Many hoped electing the strongman would end the violence. Instead, Taylor transformed the presidency into a personal fiefdom. He taxed logging and diamonds to fund his private militias. He appointed former warlords to cabinet posts. He built a personality cult with parades and radio jingles. Reports of lavish parties at his executive mansion contrasted with the hunger in refugee camps. He boasted of his role in Greater Liberia, which by then extended into neighboring Sierra Leone and Côte d'Ivoire. Taylor's ambition didn't stop at Liberia's borders. He sought to destabilize Sierra Leone and profit from its diamond fields. In 1991, the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, armed and supported by Taylor, invaded Sierra Leone. The RUF became infamous for amputating limbs and committing widespread sexual violence. Human rights reports identify amputation as their signature atrocity. Fighters hacked off hands, arms, and legs. They carved RUF into civilians with knives or razors. Women and girls were raped en masse. The RUF also conscripted children, including girls, and used slave labor in diamond mines. During particularly brutal offensives, the RUF abducted thousands of children and forced families to buy them back. Why would Taylor support such brutality? Because diamonds and arms were currency. A global witness briefing on the Taylor verdict notes that he received diamonds in exchange for weapons and ammunition, advised RUF Commander Sam Bokhari on controlling diamond mines, provided mechanical diggers and fuel, and smuggled diamonds through Liberia to international traders. Taylor wasn't merely a warlord. He was a businessman in blood. By trafficking weapons for blood diamonds, he financed his war machine and built political influence beyond Liberia. Taylor's personality had always mingled charm with menace, but as his power grew, so did his paranoia. He purged advisors suspected of disloyalty. He allegedly ordered the assassination of rivals and critics. Even allies like Prince Johnson, who had tortured and killed Samuel Doe, broke away, accusing Taylor of greed and betrayal. The war economy thrived. Logs, rubber, diamonds, and gold poured out. Guns and luxury goods poured in. Meanwhile, in rural Liberia, rebel checkpoints manned by drunk teenagers demanded tolls. Villagers risked rape or execution if they didn't comply. The brutality wasn't random. It was systematic, a form of rule. Taylor's swagger also hid vulnerability. By 1999, new rebel movements such as the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, LURD, began attacking from Guinea. The movement for democracy in Liberia, MODEL, emerged from Côte d'Ivoire. The conflicts overlapped. Fighters switched sides for money. Civilians were trapped between factions. International pressure grew. The UN imposed sanctions on Liberian timber and diamonds. ECOWAS and US diplomats demanded Taylor step down. By the summer of 2003, Taylor's government controlled less than a third of Liberia. Even his supporters were weary. When he finally resigned in August 2003 and flew to Nigeria, tens of thousands poured into the streets, not to mourn him, but to celebrate an end to his reign. As Chapter 2 closes, Taylor's story moves from the battlefield to the courtroom. His alliance with the RUF had global repercussions. In 2012, a UN-backed tribunal in The Hague convicted him on 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, sexual slavery, and the conscription of children. He had aided, abetted, and planned heinous and brutal crimes in Sierra Leone, the judges ruled. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. His charismatic persona couldn't save him then. The man who once charmed child soldiers into calling him Papai now faced justice for helping turn children into killers. In Chapter 3, we'll explore the fall, how international pressure, regional politics, and internal resistance finally cornered the warlord. We'll also examine the trial itself, the evidence, the testimony, and the lasting implications for international justice. If you found this chapter gripping, hit subscribe and stay with History Scrolls. The path from warlord to convict is full of twists, and the lessons it holds are as relevant today as ever. August 2003. Monrovia's streets fill with cheers as a warlord boards a plane into exile. By April 2012, that same man faces judges in The Hague. How does a president become a prisoner? In the summer of 2003, Charles Taylor's world was shrinking. Rebel groups, lured from Guinea and Model from Côte d'Ivoire, were closing in. The United Nations had slapped embargoes on Liberian timber and diamonds. U.S. Marines took positions off the coast. On August 11th, under heavy international pressure, Taylor addressed the nation. Dressed in immaculate white, he told Liberians he was stepping down for the love of liberty. and handed power to his vice president, Moses Blah. Hours later, he boarded a flight to Calabar, Nigeria, where President Olusegun Obasanjo granted him asylum. Tens of thousands poured into Monrovia's streets, not to protest his departure, but to celebrate the end of his reign. Taylor's exile did not last long. In March 2006, Liberia's new president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, asked Nigeria to surrender him to face charges at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Taylor vanished from his Nigerian villa, but was captured a day later near the Cameroon border. Guards found him in a vehicle filled with cash and heroin. He was flown to Freetown and then to The Hague for security reasons. The UN-backed special court built a courtroom inside a Dutch prison to try him. Liberia's Papai now stood in a dock surrounded by armed guards. The charges were unprecedented. Taylor was the first sitting or former head of state since the Nuremberg trials to face an international war crimes court. Prosecutors accused him of 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, sexual slavery, and conscripting children, stemming from his support for Sierra Leone's Revolutionary United Front, RUF. They argued that he traded weapons for diamonds, advised rebel commanders, and planned a strategy of terror that included limb amputations, mass rape, and the use of child soldiers. During the trial, which spanned from 2007 to 2011, Taylor's once enchanting charm seemed to crumble. He took the stand for 7 months, denying that he ordered atrocities and presenting himself as a peacemaker. Judges were unconvinced. In April 2012, they found him guilty on all counts. The verdict held that he had aided, abetted, and planned the commission of heinous and brutal crimes. In May 2012, the court sentenced him to 50 years in prison. Amnesty International hailed the decision as a landmark for accountability and a recognition of the suffering of tens of thousands of victims. Taylor's imprisonment did not end the legal drama. In 2013, he was transferred to a high-security prison in the UK. Under British sentencing rules, he must serve at least 2/3 of his term before becoming eligible for early release. Given that he was 64 at sentencing, he would be over 90 before any parole board even considers him. In 2015, he petitioned the court to let him serve his sentence in Rwanda, arguing that his detention in Britain violated his right to family life because his wife and children could not easily visit. The judges rejected his request, stating there was no reason to transfer him from HM Prison Frankland, that the UK conditions met international standards, and that his wife had not even applied for a visa. Taylor remains behind bars in England, one of several convicts held under the special court's residual jurisdiction. While Taylor languishes in prison, Liberia has moved forward, albeit unevenly. The end of the Civil War ushered in a period of reconstruction. Roads, schools, and hospitals were rebuilt, and a new generation grew up without gunfire. But the culture of impunity is harder to mend. A report from the Center for Justice and Accountability observes that, despite significant progress in infrastructure and security, Liberia still struggles with the legacy of wartime atrocities and an enduring failure to hold perpetrators accountable. Many ex-warlords occupy government posts. Few have faced trial. Victims still see their abusers walking free. The story of Charles Taylor is therefore more than the rise and fall of one man. It is a cautionary tale about how charisma and ambition can distort liberation into tyranny, about the allure of quick riches through blood diamonds, and about the immense human cost of war. It also shows the slow but relentless march of justice. For the first time since World War II, an international court proved that even heads of state can be held responsible for crimes committed through proxies. Taylor's conviction set a precedent for future prosecutions and gave survivors a measure of validation. As we close this documentary, we ask, how should Liberia reckon with its past? How do we honor victims when many perpetrators still wield power? The answers lie not only in courtrooms, but in continued public engagement, historical education, and the insistence that truth matters. If these stories move you, subscribe to History Scrolls. We'll keep unearthing controversial histories because understanding where we came from is the first step to shaping where we're going. See you in the next video.